Good afternoon. I'm Gregg, Wildlife Operations Division Chief in the Pennsylvania Game Commission's Bureau of Wildlife Management.
And I'm Huck, the Waterfowl Program Specialist for PGC.
Welcome to the Game Commission's Facebook Live event covering the 2023-24 waterfowl hunting seasons and bag limits. We'll be providing a lot of information in today's event. We'll also be taking some live questions later on in the hour. But we'd like to begin with a little bit of an overview of the regulations development process for waterfowl and other migratory game birds. Recognize that possibly not everyone that's watching this event may be familiar with how that process works, and it is different from a lot of the other seasons that the Game Commission sets. So for example, deer or turkeys or bears, all of those that species are resident within Pennsylvania, our Board of Game Commissioners can set the seasons without having any consideration for what, say, Ohio or New Jersey are doing for those same species. Migratory game birds are different. They're ultimately under the authority of the federal government under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, because those birds do spend time so much in different states and even different countries. So each year that process kicks off with the what's called the flyway councils getting together. Even though these species are under federal authority, the states do have some opportunity for input into the process. States send biologists to a flyway meeting to discuss population data and research questions. Those recommendations that come from the biologists then float up through the Atlantic Flyway Council or the other 3 flyway councils across the country and go to the Fish and Wildlife Service. But again, it's the federal agency, the Fish and Wildlife Service, that ultimately has the last say on how those seasons are set. The way that works then is once all those recommendations are considered, population status and so forth, the Fish and Wildlife Service issues frameworks within each flyway, and basically what the frameworks are is sort of the outer bounds of what the states are allowed to do. So for example, they may say the earliest day that you can open the waterfowl season, the latest day you can close the season, how many days of hunting you can have for each species, what the bag limits are for the species, and so forth. And states can always be more restrictive than the federal frameworks if they want to, but we can never be more liberal. So for example, if the frameworks say Pennsylvania can have a 60-day duck season in each zone, if for some reason we wanted to make the length of the season 50 days at the state level, we could do that, but we can't make it 70 days. So those frameworks come down each year from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and then as individual states, including here at Pennsylvania, we have to go through a process to make our season selections within those frameworks, and Neil talk a little bit about what we do at the state level to actually make those selections.
Thanks, Ian. So for the state level season selections, we start, generally speaking, with a comprehensive waterfowl hunter survey. Our most recent one was done in 2020, and this kind of gives us more general ideas of how hunters want to see the season set within a given zone and for a given species. And then from that survey, we'll develop proposed seasons, which we do each and every year, and we're talking about here right now. And we solicit public comment on those seasons. We really want to understand and make sure that we've done the best we can to kind of propose a season, but we want to make sure that we haven't missed something from the public or that there aren't emerging issues that weren't captured in that survey. And so we solicit that public comment, and then after the public comment period is closed, we'll kind of consider those comments, some of which we can implement, some of which we can't because we don't have the authority to. And then we'll ultimately bring those seasons and finalize them with the Fish and Wildlife Service through our season selection letter. So kind of interestingly, we're kind of always simultaneously working on 2 seasons. Right now we're proposing the 2023-24 seasons, but that flyway process that Ian talked about, we're already starting the process for 24-25.
And you can expect the seasons to be finalized probably in April. It ends up being about the same time as the final decisions are made by the Board of Commissioners for all those resident species that we talked about. And then when the Hunting and Trapping Regulations Digest comes out in conjunction with the new license year, the waterfowl and migratory game bird seasons will be included in there. So it kind of ends up looking similar at the end, but there's a whole lot different process that goes into the development of those seasons. So that's sort of a general overview that's true every year, but there are some specific issues for the 2023-24 season They're kind of unique and new and changes, and so we'd like to spend a little bit of time at the beginning here talking about some of what's changed for this year. One of those big changes is in regard to mallards, and Neil will talk a little bit about what's changing for that species.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've proposed is, which has been allowed by the federal frameworks, is increasing the mallard bag limit to 4, which can include no more than 2 hens. As many of you are probably aware, that bag limit was reduced about 4 years ago to 2 with no more than 1 hen to be included. And we're definitely hearing from the public that some of you are concerned about this change. Some of you are very happy about it. And, you know, I kind of wanted to go into a little bit of details about how we got here. So the mallard population has been declining in the Atlantic flyway for roughly 20 years. And we made that change about 4 years ago. And then coinciding, great timing with that change, COVID kind of hit, and we had 2 years of absolutely no survey data. So we were relying on other things to kind of set our seasons. And in 2022, we were able to conduct a comprehensive survey, and we noticed an 18% increase in that population. And while all that was taking place, we also were developing a new population model. And this model really allowed us to take into account all of the different monitoring streams that we have, whether it's banding, the Northeast Waterfowl Plot Survey, which is done in all the Northeast states, or the Breeding Waterfowl Habitat Survey, which is done across the Canadian provinces and Maine. And so by taking in all that data that we had, we were able to really kind of refine and better understand what was happening with the mallard population. And so really what appears to be driving this decline in mallards, it isn't hunting seasons or hunting or harvest. It appears a juvenile survival, so those birds that are in their basically almost their first year, is declining throughout that time period. And so we're not quite sure what that mechanism is that's causing that decline in that survival, but we do know that it's a non-hunting season survival. So it's basically after the hunting season is over, for some reason we're seeing that survival go down. As part of that, we have a massive research project that we've undertaken with 14 Atlantic flyway states and numerous Canadian provinces. Ducks Unlimited is involved, as well as University of Saskatchewan and SUNY Brockport. And we're kind of, with that, we are better understanding, hopefully, survival as well as nesting and productivity of these birds. So hopefully we'll be able to kind of pinpoint where that decline really is being caused and really kind of refine our population models so we can better manage these birds into the future.
The second big change that is happening in the frameworks this year is also one that's going to provide more opportunity. And again, we've heard comments both pro and con on the idea, but that change would be that this year in the AP goose zone, which is basically in southeastern Pennsylvania, the season and bag limit will both increase. We've been for the last couple of years in a 30-day season with a 1-bird bag limit. The proposed season under the frameworks is to increase to a 45-day season with a 3-bird daily bag limit. And the reason behind that, I actually would like to go back about 25 years to trace a little bit of the history. Hunters that have been hunting geese in Pennsylvania for a long time can remember back in the mid to late 1990s when Canada goose season was closed in much of the Atlantic flyway. The reason for that was that for a number of years, resident population geese had been increasing, migratory population geese had been decreasing, not because the migratory geese suddenly decided they wanted to just stay put, but just because the population dynamics were different. And those changes kind of masked each other until finally it was realized that the migratory populations had reached a critically low level, and so the season had to be closed. That led to a few changes. One thing that changed was we used banding data to delineate out the areas in the fall and winter where those migratory populations really hang out. Southeastern Pennslevania being one of those, but also, of course, running down into the Delmarva Peninsula, Chesapeake Bay, and even into northern North Carolina, and extending to some extent up into New York and New England. Areas outside of that where there weren't a lot of migratory birds, we could have more liberal seasons because essentially all the geese present in those areas were the resident population that we don't have to worry about as much from a harvest management standpoint. Another thing that changed was we just started getting better data by doing breeding surveys and banding on the breeding grounds in northern Quebec for the Atlantic population, migratory birds. And for probably about 15 years, things were just sort of cranking along, fairly stable, relatively stable population. We had what was considered a liberal season, 45 or 50 days, with a relatively large bag limit. However, during that stretch, there was a period for about 8 or 9 out of 10 years where production was below average, and then it really came to a head in 2018 when it was just a very late spring and there was virtually no gosling production from the AP geese on the Ungava Peninsula. That really caused the population, as you might expect, to decline. Fortunately, because we had that better data, we didn't get into as dire a situation as we were in the 90s where the season had to be closed. But we did have to pull back and go to a restrictive season, which, as I mentioned, was 30 days, and then depending on the year and the part of the flyway you were in, either 1 or 2 birds in the bag. During these last few years, there's been some work to develop a population model using all this good data that I've mentioned that we have over the last 20 years to sort of predict out in future years what we can expect and use that information to make a decision about the future seasons. There's been some concern that we've heard that going from 30-1 to 45-3, wow, isn't that a pretty big change? And in a sense it is, but one thing that's important to know for background is that actually last year, following that population model, that was telling us that we could have gone one step in between, so it would have been a 30-day season with a 3-bird daily bag limit. The holdup there, and again it goes back to something Nate mentioned, was COVID. Because of those issues with remote surveys, there was no population surveys, no banding in northern Quebec during 2020 or 2021, and so we really didn't have any data. There was really a lot of discussion and debate at the flyway level about what to do under those circumstances, and actually Pennsylvania voted for the 2022-23 season, let's take that one step, but we ended up being in the minority. More folks were uncomfortable just with no data for 2 years of making that step. Fortunately, in 2022, so this past year's breeding season, when survey crews and banding crews were able to get back out in the field, we found that indeed the population model was working pretty well, and it really fit with what the population trajectory was doing. And the population had bounced back, so that restrictive season did what we wanted it to do. It improved survival rates for the adults. There's also been a couple of at least decent production years in the last 3 or 4 years. And so all that means that that population is healthier again now and able to support the harvest that will come with a 45-day 3-bird bag limit. It's also important to recognize that southeastern Pennsylvania is the part of the state where we probably have the biggest issues with nuisance resident geese. And obviously a lot of the harvest, whether it's in September or the regular season, in that part of the state is resident geese. So not only are we able to provide more opportunity on these migrant birds because of their population improvement, that's also a good thing from a management standpoint because it allows hunters to be putting extra pressure on resident geese in the southeastern part of the state.
So another thing I kind of want to hit on is kind of changing gears away from those major changes to the seasons is more so just kind of general complaints that we hear from folks. Particularly, we hear a lot of complaints that the season isn't tailored just right for each person. And we see desires for earlier seasons, we see desires for later seasons. And so there's a lot of nuance in setting duck seasons because of that. We have numerous species of ducks, and everybody has their own individual ways they like to hunt. Some really like wood ducks, some really like mallards. Some would prefer to be sitting on warm October days, and some really like those opportunities in ice. And then there's even those really confounding people who love both of those opportunities. And it becomes really hard to kind of mesh all of these things in together. So, you know, another thing that I guess I would like to point out is just because you've made a comment, which we really appreciate, we really do value public input on these seasons. And just because we aren't tailoring the season to exactly what you've asked for doesn't mean, number one, that I haven't read it, because I can assure you that I read every single comment that comes through the Waterfowl comments email. But It just means that maybe we can't accommodate it this year, or maybe we can't accommodate it at all because state statute doesn't allow it or the federal frameworks don't allow it. And sometimes we hear good comments from people, but we don't feel comfortable making the change that year because we haven't presented those potential changes to the public for them to comment on. So you may not see the change this year, but we may propose it next year because we thought it was a good idea and we want to see what the public has to say. And the other thing that's kind of part of that is we have these comprehensive waterfowl surveys, or waterfowl hunter surveys that I mentioned earlier, and we often get really confounding results that become really difficult to interpret. We have everything kind of conflicts with one another, and it becomes very difficult to kind of tease out exactly what the public wants. So starting in last fall, we worked with Penn State Harrisburg to kind of conduct some focus groups and some cognitive interviews with some hunters to really understand how folks are reading these survey questions and how to better design survey questions in the future. And so starting here in a couple of months, we'll be actually implementing a new waterfowl hunter survey that'll hopefully start to try and grasp at some of these really conflicting things that we see within our surveys and to really kind of flesh out what the ideal duck season in Pennsylvania is.
Another topic that we often get questions on, although again it's not changing this year, is in regard to Sunday hunting for waterfowl. I think most that are watching this event would be aware that in 2020 the legislature approved the Game Commission to offer 3 Sundays of hunting, and we've had those the last 3 Sundays in November each of the last few years. So that's been some additional opportunity, especially for deer and bear hunting, but also in several cases for small game, as long as those seasons overlap those Sundays. We certainly know that many hunters appreciate that additional opportunity that's been provided by those additional 3 days, and so it's a natural question, why do we still have those Sundays closed for waterfowl? And the answer is that if we added those 3 Sundays to waterfowl seasons, we'd actually lose hunting opportunity. And I know that every time I say that, people say, how do you become a biologist with the Game Commission when you can't do 3rd grade math? But there is actually an explanation when you get into the details. The reason for it is that there's an arrangement, again, as I mentioned, migratory game bird hunting is ultimately under federal authority. And years ago, the Fish and Wildlife Service put a provision in place for Pennsylvania and other states that didn't allow Sunday hunting of what's called compensatory days. And basically the way that works is when you set up your season dates and count up the number of days that you're allowed, the Sundays that fall within that stretch don't count against you. So you're not allowed to hunt them because of state law, but they don't count against your allotment of hunting days that the Fish and Wildlife Service offers. The catch to that whole thing is that as soon as you allow migratory game bird hunting on any Sunday, you lose your compensatory days for all Sundays. And so in the situation that we're currently in with Sunday hunting only being allowed on those 3 Sundays, yes, we could open those 3 days to waterfowl hunting and gain those 3 Sundays, but we lose all our compensatory days, and so the net effect would be to lose opportunity. I like to use the Lake Erie Duck Zone as an example for this. It's sort of simple because it's a 60-day season that we typically set to run straight through. Typically, that season opens right at the end of October or the beginning of November, and so it runs through with no Sundays open, obviously, but all of the Sundays count as compensatory days, so that gives us 9 days that we can tack on at the end of the season, and so the season runs through usually the end of the first week of January, depending on exactly how the calendar falls. If you hypothetically add in those 3 Sundays that we could add in late November, and say we still opened the season in late October, early November, yes, we'd add those 3 Sundays, but by losing our compensatory days, all those Sundays within that October through December time period that would still be closed to hunting under state law would actually count against us as if they were hunting days from the federal perspective. And so if we did that, we'd end up with having about a 55-day season rather than a 60-day season, and the season would close basically at the end of December rather than running into January. So just the combination of the compensatory days and the way that the limitation currently is that 3 Sundays are allowed in Pennsylvania is a combination where by adding a few Sundays, we'd actually lose more hunting opportunity overall. Certainly, if and when the legislature gives the Game Commission the authority to open all Sundays to hunting, that's something that could be revisited, because then we wouldn't have that limitation where we'd be losing compensatory days. And if and when that happens, it's certainly something we'll take another look at. But ultimately, if Sunday hunting for waterfowl is something that you're interested in, it really needs to be directed to your legislator before the Game Commission can do anything about it.
Another thing that we commonly hear from hunters is, why isn't that duck season closed during deer season? Some people are really concerned about safety issues as it relates to deer season. Others just would prefer to be out deer hunting rather than having this conflict of, should I be deer hunting or should I be duck hunting today? And, you know, others just feel like that's the right time for the split to be. But as it pertains to the federal frameworks that Ian's kind of discussed a couple of times, we're only allowed one split in the duck season. So right now in the south zone or the north zone, we have that split kind of in that late October, early November timeframe. The northwest zone kind of has that split during the deer season, and then the Erie zone, we don't split it at all. But since we could only have one, for example, in the south zone, that would mean that we would have to run the season from that early October timeframe, and the season would look kind of similar to that northwest zone, and we'd lose some of that late January opportunity. And so another thing that we know for almost for certain based on our survey data, this one's pretty much not confusing as a result, and from our focus groups and our cognitive interviews, is Thanksgiving is a really important day for our duck hunters. A lot of people treat that as a very traditional day, even if the hunting's not great, even if it's warm, even if the weather is terrible for duck hunting. It seems like a large number of folks really enjoy that opportunity to be out with their families and hunting. And so that creates this other big conflict with how do we have one split and make sure that we include Thanksgiving but not include deer season. And it gets kind of convoluted, and which is why we've ended up with the seasons that we propose right now. One thing that we could potentially do during the next open season on zones and splits is we could move to a two-zone setup, at least what is allowed right now, to have two splits in the season. So we could have the same split that we have now, and we could have another split during that Thanksgiving time frame. And those surveys that I've been talking about earlier are going to kind of try and get at, is that something that we want to explore, or is that something that we don't want to explore?
So as you can see, there's a lot of issues that we get questions about, some of which we can't do or can do because of what the federal frameworks say, others that are related to state law, and this next one that I'm going to be talking about is another one that's related to state law. We're sitting here on, March 9th. Most waterfowl seasons are long over at this point. Duck seasons ended in January, even in the RP zone. The goose season ended in late February, but there is one hunting opportunity still going on, and that's the light goose conservation order. In fact, that'll run into April, even though by the time you get into April, there's typically not many light geese around. And a question that we typically get in that regard is, why can't we use unplugged shotguns during the conservation order? The Fish and Wildlife Service, under most circumstances, doesn't allow some types of aids to hunting. Electronic calls, hunting after sunset, and unplugged guns are three examples of those. But they do allow exceptions for those three things in a few cases where it's needed for population control, for example, for light geese. That gets back to the state level. We have, without getting too technical, what we call Title 34 or statute, which is controlled by the legislature. Only the elected representatives can make changes in Title 34. Then there's Title 58 or regulation, which our Board of Commissioners can make changes to. Back in 2009, when the conservation order first came in the Atlantic Flyway, we made changes. The Board of Commissioners made changes to allow hunting to 1/2 hour after sunset, as well as electronic calls. There's actually language written into Title 34, the legislative statute, that allowed the Board of Commissioners to do that. Back in 2009, we really didn't look at unplugged guns too much for a variety of reasons. As that issue has come up and been of interest more and more in recent years, we've taken a little bit more look at it. And what we found is actually the language that's written into statute that allowed the Board of Commissioners to make those other changes doesn't exist for unplugged shotguns. So this is another issue similar to the Sunday hunting that I talked about earlier, that for unplugged guns to be allowed during the conservation order in Pennsylvania, it would have to be a change first made by the legislature in Title 34 to then allow the Board of Commissioners to adopt that. And if and when that happens, it's certainly something we'll take a look at. There are 8 states in the Atlantic Flyway that participate in the conservation order, and currently Pennsylvania is the only one of those 8 states that doesn't allow unplugged shotguns. So certainly something that we will take a look at if and when we're given the authority to do that by the legislature.
So I'm going to address a question that kind of came through on, so this one is specific to, do we have plans to flood original ponds on PGC's Hoover Island and the Susquehanna River? And so I can't speak specifically to that issue. I know we have management issues on some of those in terms of access and things like that. But I do want to take this opportunity to kind of highlight some big wetland initiatives that we have going on. We recently underwent a really massive inventory of all of our wetland infrastructure across the Commonwealth. And so we now have a better idea of what's being managed and what has issues, what's kind of fallen in disrepair for various reasons. And as part of that, we identified, our senior staff approved the spending of $6 million to kind of improve some of that infrastructure across the state. So we've identified 189 potential project sites, and we just got started underway in really starting the groundwork of implementing those changes, or implementing those improvements. And so hopefully in the next few years, you're going to see more wetland habitat on your local state game lands, and hopefully you'll see more management of those. If you notice any signs, we've got signs and things like that, kind of noting these different project areas. And so if you see them, yeah, hopefully you know where that's coming from, and look forward to more coming out in the future on that.
Yeah, that really is an exciting initiative for somebody like me that's been around the agency for 20 plus years now. We have the opportunities now in place, partly with the Game Commission's healthy financial situation, and also with the staff, Nate and others that we've brought on just in the last few years. We really have capacity to do a lot of those habitat projects that we just haven't had for a lot of my career, so it's really exciting for me to see all these things moving forward. We are at the stage of the event now where we're starting to take questions that are coming in from viewers, so it's always a little bit tricky for us. You might be able to stump us with something you ask. We'll do our best to answer questions that we know the answers to. In some cases, things may come in that are maybe more of a law enforcement or a regional question, and we don't want to try to get out of our lane and answer for them, so we may take some of that information and try to follow up with folks later if we really don't know the answer. I'll address the next question that came in. That's related to the Sunday migratory bird hunting that we talked about earlier. The commenter asks, if legislation were to pass to allow Sunday migratory bird hunting, is there any indication or any fear that it would have an adverse impact on overall population levels of ducks and geese? In other words, if those compensatory days were converted into Sunday hunting, would we have any concerns from a biological standpoint? It's a great question. I guess the shortest answer is that we don't know for sure. It will be helpful to have a little bit of information on hunter behavior and harvest, which I don't have at the tip of my tongue from these Sundays that we've had for other species, so for small game, deer and bear, exactly what is the participation in harvest on a Sunday versus a weekday. I guess my speculation would be that given that it's a relatively small number of days and probably not a huge difference, particularly given that a lot of waterfowl hunters are really avid and are going to get out there when the weather and the migration is right, regardless of what day of the week it is. It probably wouldn't be a big enough impact to be measurable, but it certainly would be something that we'd want to keep a look on, keep an eye on, and keep track of. There's a lot of these kind of questions. It comes up in the same regard with things like high technology decoys and that type of thing. As you make all these little changes that perhaps make hunters more effective, what biological impact does that have? And so as managers, we have to have some tough discussions sometimes about, do we want to allow certain types of opportunity or certain types of technology? if that means you need to trade off by having shorter seasons. And again, that gets back to something Nate said earlier, because if you ask 1,000 different hunters, you're probably going to get 200 different answers on where they'd like to put that line between more technology with shorter seasons or longer seasons with less technology. So great question, and if and when we get to that point, it's something we'll look at closely, of whether adding Sundays in rather than compensatory weekdays would have any biological impacts, and whether there'd be any adjustments that we need to make accordingly.
The next question we got is about avian flu. So did the avian flu impact waterfowl populations and the upcoming hunting season plans and management strategies? So generally speaking, waterfowl are more of a carrier of avian flu, but not necessarily actually expressing the disease itself and really being negatively impacted by it. We have seen a few die-offs in a few places, mostly with Canada geese. And we know that juvenile snow geese, for some reason, also generally tend to experience a little more mortality than most species. But most of the time, they're completely asymptomatic. We handle them during the banding periods, and I couldn't tell you which one has it and which one doesn't. And sometimes we go to sites where there's 100% of the birds are infected, and you couldn't tell at all. So generally speaking, no, avian flu hasn't really had negative impacts on waterfowl populations, at least with those within Pennsylvania. There are some species like eiders that might have taken it, might have seen a little more die-offs and might be a little more concerning, but for those species within Pennsylvania, no, we didn't really see too many negative impacts.
It certainly is a big concern because, as Nate mentioned, avian flu isn't a major mortality factor for waterfowl. They're kind of the natural reservoirs for it. But it can be devastating to poultry, and another part of my job with the Game Commission is overseeing the pheasant propagation program. So we've had to be really vigilant, and knock on wood, so far so good that we haven't had any avian influenza outbreaks on the pheasant farms. But that is a disease that can just wipe out pheasants or chickens or turkeys. And so it is, in the big picture, somewhat of concern. And I would say, particularly for waterfowl hunters that maybe have chickens or other poultry at home, you do need to be really careful. Just use common sense like you do in handling and cleaning any other game species, but be really careful not to wear your boots that you've worn waterfowl hunting into an area that might have poultry or anything along those lines. It's also not typically, there's some rare cases where humans have been infected with avian flu, but it's not a big health issue for people either, although again, just better to be safe than sorry.
Yeah, so another question that we have coming in is there any way we can give up days in the early season so waterfowl hunters can hunt the last week of January? And again, this kind of gets back to some of the stuff that I've already discussed a little bit, but just to kind of rehash it out again, we see a lot of hunters arguing particularly for that week of January, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say that we have almost, especially in the South Zone, we have almost as many hunters arguing for more early opportunity, or saying that hunting to January 20th is too late. They're frozen out and they don't have that opportunity. So while we see this kind of push generally for the last week of January, we see almost the same push to say we've already gone too late. So there's really a lot of balance there, and just something that folks really need to be aware of, that just because you or your hunting party generally wants to see a change doesn't mean that the people outside of your core group and the people that you talk with don't think differently.
Yep. It's always a challenge for us to address that. The next question, the commenter Dave asks, why does spring migration through western Pennsylvania seem to bring more ducks than the fall migration? He specifically noticed that in the Pymatoonie area. Nate will probably be able to add a little bit to what I say here, because he's probably kept a little bit closer pulse on some of the eBird and other data that's related to migration. It's an interesting observation. It's actually something I always noticed. First part of my career was spent in the Poconos for about 10 years, and it was the same thing there. Ducks would sort of seem to burn through during the fall, but you'd see more species and a lot of times higher numbers during the spring. Part of that's probably just a factor of hunting season, obviously. I mean, like anything else, if you're in an area and you're getting shot at, you're going to be more likely to vacate that which is happening in the fall, obviously, whereas not in the spring where you have less disturbance. Also, weather is a factor to some extent. There's obviously different things happening biologically in the fall where you have young of the year making their first migration. Basically, at that time of year, it's just a matter of getting enough food to offset the calories that you're burning, and depending on what the weather is, how much snow's on the ground, what's available in terms of aquatic vegetation or acorns or waste corn in fields, whatever that species happens to eat. That has a big influence on how soon and how fast they need to move south. Once you get into the springtime, you have a lot of birds already paired up from on the wintering grounds or pairing during migration or getting ready to reproduce, and so it's a whole different biological dynamic of what's happening. Again, sort of following the snow line and the ice line north and trying to be the first one on the good breeding areas without getting there so early that a late storm impacts your breeding. So there's very, very different biological issues going on. And I don't know if, Nate, if you can add anything to that in terms of patterns that you've observed in recent years.
Yeah, I would say that generally speaking, and we kind of see this in some of these transmitter mallards and transmitter black ducks, we see the birds hang up north, not nearly as long as you might think they do. Most of them only hang up until kind of that December time frame, and then they make a jump right to those areas where they plan on wintering. And so a lot of those birds are arriving in kind of that early to mid-December time frames. And so, and then, yeah, what I think, again, we're speculating on something that we don't have transmitters on most of these species, so we don't know this for a fact. But yeah, they're kind of just generally start pushing back north and making longer stops. It's beneficial for these birds flying those longer distance. A lot of them, when they're going to their wintering areas, they probably know what to expect. They've probably been there before, but on the way back north, they make shorter jumps and make longer stops to kind of refuel. And so we tend to see that, yeah, in the spring we get considerably higher diversity. I know right now there's hundreds of pintails and green-winged teals sitting at Haldeman Island, for example. And so, yeah, we see that really generally across the state and across the country.
Yeah, which I guess, and that brings up another good point, that this is a great time for waterfowl viewing. Certainly Middle Creek's always the highlight of that around this time of year, with the large numbers of snow geese and tundra swans. But there's also lots of different duck use, and that's true certainly not just at Middle Creek, but a lot of places around the state. So if you got a little bit of cabin fever, this winter certainly hasn't been the most harsh one of all, but if you like to get out and do a little bit of wildlife observation, this is a great time to do it. The ducks are colored up. It's a great time to view them, photograph them, and spend some time outdoors. The next question asked is, are there any planned changes to the Pymatuning and Middle Creek management areas to improve hunter access and or waterfowl use? This is another one I'm going to, after I make a few comments, I'll defer to Nate because I think he has a little more detail than I might. I guess the general answer in both of those circumstances would be that we're constantly looking, and again, these are areas that are managed by regional staff, so we don't want to step on their toes too much by misstating anything or trying to say things that might not be accurate. But they're always constantly looking at the controlled hunting programs, the open areas for hunting, the habitat use on the areas, and again, this is where some of those habitat projects come in that we will be doing in the next few years to improve waterfowl habitat. So in that sense, there's always evaluation going on, potential changes. Again, anyone that's spent any time hunting at Pymatuning and or Middle Creek has seen some of those changes over time. Nate, is there anything else we can say about specific changes that are in the works, or maybe need to defer that to regional staff for some more specific responses? Yeah,
I'd probably defer the rest of that to regional staff for more specific on what changes they're talking about and thinking about. So I see two more kind of questions that are kind of covering generally the same thing here. We have one question asking to extend the length of the split for the North Duck Zone and add those days onto the late season in January, and another asking to add a split to the Lake Erie Zone. So specific to the Lake Erie Zone, we did kind of bump that season back a little bit more than it traditionally would have been. We kind of started it the first week in November because it kind of was falling a little early in October this year. But as it pertains to both of these questions, it kind of gets back into that nuance of balancing everybody's interests. And some people really like to hunt later, as both of these commenters clearly want to. But it can be really difficult. And, just because this year was very, very warm doesn't mean that next year we won't have kind of a more normal winter and see more frozen conditions here later. And so it's really a balancing act, and that's a big fear always, is that maybe we end up freezing out and losing opportunity.
Yeah, it'd sure be nice as a waterfowl biologist if you could predict the weather with great accuracy 3 to 6 months in advance, because some years people think we're geniuses because the weather hits just right with the way the seasons are set up. Other years they think we're idiots because it didn't work out that way. And some of it you just have to do your best with long-term averages and recognize that not every year is going to work out the best. Kind of jumping around a little bit, lots of good questions coming in. I'm going to save the nest incubation question for Nate because he's running the current transmitter project. But Sharon asks, what's the best way to get questions answered regarding a specific area? She's wondering specifically about time and tuning and the regulations there. And again, in general, I'd say that needs to go through the regional office that handles that area. In the case of pine and tuning, it would be the Northwest Regional Office. You could either go on the Game Commission website or in your Hunting and Trapping Digest, if you have one, for the contact information for the Northwest region, and bring those specific questions to them. They'll be in the best position to respond to those questions and concerns.
Yeah, so specific to the question about average date of nest incubation for the transmitted resident geese, it depends on where they are. So we have birds in southeast, and our earliest incubation started in late March last year, with most of the birds starting in early to mid-April. And then when you move up to northwest Pennsylvania, we saw quite a few of those birds more towards the mid to late April timeframe, just later, generally later seasons. It's highly variable. We know of at least one pair that successfully nested and hatched in early February in York already, so that means that bird was likely started incubating sometime around January 1st, which means she was laying eggs through that cold blast that we had on December 24th. So, it can be highly variable, but Canada geese have this amazing ability to incubate through some really terrible weather.
Yeah, there's really interesting to see some of those unique individual things. From a big picture population management standpoint, it really doesn't matter that much, but it's still really interesting to see some of these things and speculate about why they happen. Sometimes it raises more questions than we have answers, but always interesting. One more question that we have at this point, and that is, how long do snow geese live? The commenter Joseph shot one this year that was banded and was 15 years old. Hopefully that one you made into jerky or tenderized somehow, because those older birds do tend to be a little bit tougher to eat. This is another one I'll maybe throw to Nate for a little bit of information. It certainly varies by species, and as you might expect, some of the smaller birds, teal, wood ducks, mallards, have shorter lifespans than some of the bigger birds. I think, and again, Nate can correct me if I'm wrong, but typically the longevity records for snow and Canada geese are probably in the mid to upper 20s range. Obviously, those are 1 in a million. A much more common lifespan is 3, 4, 5 years. So even a 15-year-old goose, snow goose or Canada goose, is pretty old. We do recapture every year as we're doing resident Canada goose banding across the state. It's not all that uncommon to recapture a bird that's 10 or 12 years old. So they do certainly have a longer lifespan than some other species. Nate, if you have anything to add on waterfowl lifespans?
Yeah, I mean, some of those Canada geese, definitely within Pennsylvania, we see, it seems like almost every single year we see birds that are, close to 20. Getting over 20 for a goose, even for a long-lived goose, can be something, but it's amazing for snow geese that they tend to live quite a long time once they become adults. I think their life history of, going to big flocks and stuff like that can be really beneficial to avoiding hunter harvest, and I think that's pretty much most of their mortality late in life like that.
All right, that looks like it's all the questions that we've had come in. Certainly, feel free to continue sending comments into the Waterfowl comments email address at any point, or other locations on the Game Commission website. The public comments for this year's season selections close on March 19th, so you've got about 10 more days to get your comments in. Again, we'll repeat, as we've said before, we certainly consider all those, recognize that everybody's got their own location and type of hunting that they do that really reflects how they would like to see the seasons, but just remember that we want those comments, we take them seriously, we listen, but we also are looking at hundreds, if not thousands, of other hunters around the state that are commenting and that have responded to surveys. And we're trying to balance all those perspectives for the best outcome for the hunters in general. So thanks again for tuning in, and have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And if you're going to be in the Northeast region here on Saturday, the Waterfowl Open House is going to be at noon at the Northeast Regional Office. So come check it out.